the early 1960s. We're talking about essentially a 60-year run of GOP control of the Idaho government. 60 years, which, by the way, some enterprising Democratic candidate for office could say to any audience, if you are unhappy with any of the laws, the rules, the regulations in this state, unhappy with any policies on education or on property taxes, you have only one place to look, one only, and that's to the party that has, in fact, written every law, every regulation, every rule, every policy. That's what an enterprising Democratic candidate for office would be. But that's a footnote to what I say. The reality here is that by crossing over, Democrats also tend to obviously lose more voting power in the general election. Consider the last time that Butch Otter ran for office, that he won by some 12,500 votes in the primary. There were about 1,300 or 1,400 Democrats who crossed the aisle. There were roughly 3,500 unaffiliated independents that voted for Butch Otter. You tally those two together, and I don't teach math, but that seems like it's roughly 4,000 to 5,000 votes. That would not have made a difference in the primary, would it? Would not have. But those are 1,300 or 1,400 Democrats, 3,500 unaffiliated independents who might have voted in the Democratic Party and made choices that would have improved the Democratic opportunities. If, in fact, Democrats are going to cross over to support the Republican Party, to save the Republicans from themselves, because that's the essential plea, isn't it? Then we recognize that the Democrats are committing a real taboo in party politics, because political parties are established to compete for power. That's the whole reason why parties organize. You organize so that you can win power, because then you can move your agenda. But the Democrats are essentially sacrificing or surrendering power when they cross over to support the Republican Party. And mind you, it doesn't stop at the state legislative level. If you think about this and peel the layers off this proverbial onion, it has implications for national office as well. Because when Democrats cross over and strengthen the party at the expense of the Democratic Party, it also means either directly or indirectly, then Democrats are supporting candidates for national office who probably do not share their views. Think about this. Which of the national office holders, which member of the delegation from Idaho serving in the House of Representatives or the US Senate has voted to support voting rights? Which member of the Idaho delegation is standing strong for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? Which member of the GOP delegation is voting to support any number of causes near and dear to Democrats? So you not only continue one-party rule at the state level at the expense of the growth and prosperity of the Democratic Party, but Democrats are also supporting Republicans at the national level. And as the party becomes more and more dominant in the state, to the point where its candidates are winning 60% of the vote regularly, give or take a few percentage points, then that simply means that tends to deter other Democrats from participating or voting, because they say to themselves, what's the point? Why should I go out and vote? Why should I contribute money? Why should I offer resources to the Democratic Party as a whole or Democratic candidates when they're going to be defeated so easily. That tends to diminish the size and strength, the vitality of the Democratic Party going forward. If you cross over and support the Republican Party, you see, then that has a deterrent effect on participation among Democrats. It has a deterrent effect when it comes to contributing resources. That's time, that's energy, that's dollars to the Democratic Party. It will lead further to the practice of simply denigrating the Democratic Party, as so many do, as a party that has nothing to offer Idahoans. So you're contributing to your own denigration. Who would like to contribute? Who here, raise your hands, would like to contribute to your own denigration? Who here would like to participate in a practice of demeaning yourselves, making yourselves part of a joke? So when that appeal comes for Democrats to cross over, you see, it's not as simple as, in this case, cross over, vote for Brad Little, and save the state from, say, Janice McGeehan, which is a popular plea. In the first place, Governor Little is not likely to have any trouble dispatching Janice McGeehan. So there's no need to cross over. The reality is it would be in the long-term interests of the Democratic Party, in fact, in the immediate, the intermediate, and the long-term interests of the Democratic Party to continue to support Democrats and try to build the party. We often say if you continue to do what you've always done, then you know what the results will be. So if you continue, if Democrats support Republicans in the primaries, you'll continue to get the same legislature, the same kinds of laws and policies that have governed the state for 60 years. That's the result. That's the result if Democrats cross over. Now you want to ask yourselves, wait a minute, isn't there a larger cause here? Because just look how deadly it would be for the state to have a far right winger instead of a more moderate governor, as a hypothetical, right? Most people would say that, but let's be realistic. Is in fact the incumbent governor likely to be seriously challenged by the lieutenant governor? I think not. And secondly, if you're going to support the more moderate governor, ask the more moderate Democrats would ask the more moderate governor, are you going to support, add the words? Are you going to support a real investment in education? Not an investment that looks really large precisely because of all the holdbacks, the cutbacks, and now the use of federal money, which, by the way, you've denigrated all along. Is there going to be a difference in policy on most of the issues? Would there really be a difference in policy? And on any given issue, whether we're talking about a state legislative seat or, for that matter, in Congress, if any of our incumbent members of the Idaho delegation in Washington are challenged in the primary by a right winger, as some are, or at least one is, ask yourself, if the incumbent is not going to support voting rights, then, and other issues, policies, concerns that are at the heart of your membership in the Democratic Party, why would you help that incumbent? What would be the difference? What's the loss to you if in fact the incumbent should be defeated? So the reality is that crossing over among Democrats does not have an immediate, an intermediate, or a long-term benefit to the Democratic Party. For all those who really, truly would like a better state of affairs, who would truly like to rescue the Republican Party from itself, the better approach is for so-called moderate Republicans and independents to join the Democratic Party and help mold and shape the Democratic Party in its image, in their image, or to move policy proposals, alter the platform in a way that better reflects their own views, because not only would that allow them an opportunity to participate meaningfully in the formulation of public policy on any given issues, but more importantly, and this goes right to the heart of the very proposal for Democrats to cross over, it would place the far right folks on an island. It would render them irrelevant. It would render them harmless. Why? Because if all those in the Republican Party who hold office and others who support them, who claim to so despise the far right wingers and ask the Democrats to help them, defected, that is, joined the Democratic Party, then that number of far right wingers in the legislature, Priscilla Giddings and others, would shrink to such a small number that they'd be irrelevant. They would shrink to such a small number, the Idaho Freedom Foundation would have nobody to bully, rendering the Idaho Freedom Foundation irrelevant. And those who self-style themselves as more moderates would have an opportunity to generate policy reform in a newly shaped Democratic Party. They would not have to look over their shoulder. So many members of the Idaho legislature complain privately that they are intimidated by the Idaho Freedom Foundation, but that can only be true if in fact they have to fear the Freedom Foundation because they'll be primaried. But once the far right is rendered irrelevant, harmless, without power, then nobody would have to fear the far right anymore. Then you could ask yourself, what might education policies look like in the state? What would funding look like for education? What would be the budgetary implications for Boise State University and University of Idaho and Idaho State and the other colleges in this state? What would be the implications of public policy on all manner of subjects if in fact those voting, those drafting the laws, those creating the policies did not have to fear being primaried? Would that change the picture substantially for where Idaho stands on these key issues? Might it change it so substantially that Idaho would no longer be at the very bottom of the states when it comes to education funding? Could that change? Would the policies in other areas be substantially changed? Might Idaho finally move in a direction so well modeled by states across the country and create a truly progressive income tax system instead of a regressive income tax system? You have an opportunity then to consider all kinds of policy reforms. You have an opportunity to establish your dream list of laws and regulations and policies that means so much to you. But it cannot happen as long as the GOP remains in power as it's been for 60 years, and Democrats come to the aid of Republicans as Republicans are asking them to do. There is a lesson to be learned in party politics. There's a lesson to be learned in power politics. If, for example, Democrats did not cross over, and if, in fact, moderate Republicans joined the Democratic Party along with independents, then people could see very clearly where the right wing stands on all the issues that matter to them. And if along the way, in the course of a more competitive political process, you get a candidate or two whom you really despise, who wins that office by virtue of the fact that the Republican Party has fielded them through their own thinking, including closing the primary, then isn't there something to be said for the old common sense proverb, You reap what you sow. Should there not be some accountability for a political party if it makes wrong-headed procedural decisions, if it creates structural problems that will in fact undercut what they want to achieve, that if in fact they have created a primary system which is necessarily going to force far right wingers to the top, should they not, A, be held accountable, and shouldn't they suffer the consequences of their own decisions? Because what happens in politics is this: when voters observe that a political party in power has rendered the state last in the nation when it comes to education funding, and it has created policies which cut short the opportunities and aspirations of Idaho children through lack of education funding, that undermine the opportunities for Idahoans to aspire to a better life. Once people see that, in fact, the laws, the policies, the programs that exist are the handiwork of that party, wouldn't wise, observant, reasonable voters say to themselves, maybe I don't want to support that party, because for 60 years, that party has generated all the laws, all the policies, all the programs that we have, and I'm not so happy with my life in Idaho. But until you get some policies that really affect people, where it hurts, that hurts them where they live, they're not likely to engage in a real reappraisal of their own actions and their own membership in that party. This is essentially what happened in the state of Colorado in the early 1970s when Gary Hart and Patricia Schroeder and a couple of others simply assumed control of the Democratic Party, pushed the party in a new direction to show Coloradoans just where they stood with respect to quality of life, education, their own aspirations. And so they changed the party. That's really what Democrats could be looking to do rather than crossing over and aiding and abetting the efforts of the majority party. What would Idaho look like if, in fact, there was an honest reappraisal? Maybe people would say, life is fine. It might well be the case that a majority of Idahoans would say, I like Idaho fine. Doesn't matter to me, they might say. Doesn't matter to me that the minimum wage in the state is $7.25, where it stood for 40 years or so. Doesn't matter to me if my children are not the beneficiaries of a more education-minded legislature. Doesn't matter to me that my state has a regressive income tax. Doesn't matter to me that we have a huge budget surplus and the goal is to turn it back to the wealthy in the state and the corporations instead of investing it in education or providing property tax relief. American voters don't have an opportunity to reappraise except when they're hit squarely in the face with the repercussions of their own voting and their own membership in the state. So in sum, and I'll stop here shortly, in sum, I don't see what the gains are for Democrats to cross over. I understand the fear factor. I do understand that in fact, if you don't cross over, that you may help elect Janice McGeehan by indirect action or inaction, as opposed to Brad Little. But ask yourselves this: what if? What if the Republicans in their primary decided to choose Janice McGeehan? Doc, is there a doctor in the house? If the Republican Party chose Janice McGeehan to be their candidate, to carry the banner and fly the flag of the GOP, that's their choice, isn't it? It's their choice. They went to court in 2012 to win a lawsuit exercising their First Amendment right, their associational right under freedom of association. They won. They closed the primary. If voters did see that the GOP decided to elect Janice McGeachin and the policies under a McGeachin governorship proved to be less than what Idahoans like, turned out to turn their stomach, so to speak, at that point, would voters not say to themselves, maybe, I don't want to be part of that party that would elect that candidate to the state's highest office? If Democrats participate in bailing out the Republican Party to save Republicans from themselves, there'll be no day of atonement, no opportunity for Democrats to say, wake up, and to say to Republicans and independents, wake up and look to see what you've sown here through your decisions. We often say in American politics that Americans get the government they deserve. That's because we have the right to vote. We get the government we deserve because we have the opportunity to vote. And that works so long as Americans, A, vote, and B, those votes are counted accurately. And that means that voters everywhere have real motivation to participate and turn out to vote so they get the government that they deserve. But before there's a general election, there's a primary. And since the Republicans chose to close their primary, then it stands to reason that they should stand with their candidate. They should have to accept the candidate that their party membership chooses. There's not much of a future for the Democratic Party if Democratic voters cross over and vote for candidates who appear to be more moderate, but in the end are not more moderate. The acid test of a candidate's moderation is this: will they, upon election, vote differently than the far right candidates? And will they stand up to the far right, denounce their policies, challenge the views of the far right, and make sure that they stand on a different island, not to be part of, let's say, the decision to prohibit the teaching of critical race theory, even though nobody in Idaho does it and very few understand it? Do they want to be a part of that machinery, or do they want to be separate? Watch in the next election, whether it's in this primary or in a general election. Observe the assertion that moderates in the Republican Party have won, and ask yourselves, how will they vote? Do they vote differently? Do they denounce wrong-headed policies that in fact don't serve the interests of average, ordinary Idahoans, and certainly do not reflect the values of Democratic voters? Thank you. I'll stop here and see if we have some. I told Pug to keep the motor running so that I could hurry out here after I spoke in case it was necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Adler.
Thank you.
Because we had a little bit of a late start for our online audience, I just want to recap a few of the highlights from our introduction. That we want to thank our sponsors who make this possible: Northwest Nazarene University, NNU College of Business, and our forum series sponsors: AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Echelon Group, Micron, Optum Idaho, Pacific Source Health Plans, and Small Mind Development. We are also thankful for the grant funding from Idaho Humanities Council, and to our media partners, Boise State Public Radio, Idaho Statesman, Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, BSU and NNU. Dr. Adler, we'll begin, because we did get a little bit of a late start. If you would recap maybe the first 5 minutes or so of a high-level overview of your talk, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, you bet. Thank you. So the high point was the wonderful introduction you gave me. And then I said hello and how nice it was to be back here on the BSU campus here at the Alturas Institute and to join the City Club again. The essential points that I'm making is I understand, like everybody else, the motivation for Republicans to appeal to Democrats to cross over and vote in the Republican primaries, because the dominant fear is the election of right-wingers whose views and policy positions might be anathema, not only to a lot of Republicans, but certainly to Democrats. Therefore, as a strategy, the request for Democrats to cross over and vote in the Republican primary is nothing less than an appeal by Republicans to Democrats: save us from ourselves. Save us from the fact that we chose to create a closed primary, which would necessarily mean that the right-wingers are going to move to the top and dominate the field. And secondly, save us because if they are elected, then in fact, it will hurt not only the Republican Party, but the state of Idaho. And oh, by the way, that means Democrats. So Democrats are asked to be firefighters, rush to help put out the fire. The reality is that, as I pointed out, when Democrats are asked to do this, I raise the question, what do Democrats get in return? Are any Republicans appealing to Democrats to say, come join us, vote for the more moderate Republican candidates in these primaries, and we will support you on a few issues that are near and dear to your hearts? Maybe it is reducing the property tax. Maybe it is repeal of the sales tax on grocery. Maybe it is add the words. Maybe it is a genuine investment in the future of education. Maybe it's increasing the minimum wage. You name it. Tell us what your 2 or 3 most important aspirations are, and I will do that. As far as I know, no such negotiations are ongoing. There have been no such discussions as far as I am aware. I haven't heard of anybody even raising that possibility. So why would Democrats essentially give away the milk? Why would they give away the cows to support Republicans with nothing in return? I then also pointed out that in many ways, the question about electing moderate Republicans is something of a ruse, because those candidates who style themselves moderate Republicans during the primaries turn out not to vote differently than those who are denigrated as far right-wing legislators. And if they're not going to vote differently, if they won't vote differently and they won't stand up to be counted and denounce the right-wing perspective, which includes punishing Boise State University for its emphasis on diversity and inclusivity, then really what is the value of the so-called moderate Republicans in the legislature? And indeed, if they won't vote differently, if they won't stand up to be counted and stand against the right-wingers, then are they really moderates? Or are they just styling themselves as moderates to create a distinction, perhaps a false distinction, in their campaigns against their primary opponents? And if they're not, in fact, moderates, and Democrats cross over to help the alleged moderates, then who has just been fooled? Haven't the Democrats just been played for fools at the expense of the growth, significance, and perhaps continuation of the Democratic Party? In other words, Democrats would be giving up their own time, energy, and resources to help Republicans when they could be helping themselves. So why would they not want to engage in a vote, exercise their vote in a way that would help the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates who hold their own views, who share their own basic policy positions? Otherwise, the Democrats are being asked to come put out the fire, and they're getting nothing in return. And as I pointed out, that's simply not likely that crossing over is going to make a difference in a race. As I mentioned, in the last time that Butch Otter ran In the primary, I think he had the support of 1,300 Democrats who crossed over, maybe 3 times as many unaffiliated independents who crossed over. The combined total of those 2 groups didn't make a difference because he won by more than 12,000 votes. And there is a lot to be said for the commitment of Democrats to the commitment of to their own party, because the Democratic Party is not going to grow if their members, that is their own voters, are defecting to support Republicans who don't share their policies. And finally, what could the state look like if in fact so-called moderate Republicans and independents joined forces with Democrats, either crossed over in the primaries, which they wouldn't have to do because the Democrats have an open primary anyway, truly a big tent operation. But what if moderate Republicans and independents joined the Democratic Party, reshaped it, helped to change positions on policies so that it became the majority party? The net effect, the most significant effect, given the fears of Idahoans who are pleading to Democrats to cross over, is you would render the right-wingers irrelevant. They would be irrelevant, they would be impotent, they would soon be forgotten because they would be placed on an island, unable to affect policy. Think about that, unable to affect policy. It would be so small. It would also greatly weaken the Idaho Freedom Foundation, deprive it of its power to intimidate Idaho legislators who are members of the Republican Party. So what Democrats should be doing is saying, we won't cross over, but instead they say to the moderate Republicans and independents, you come join us. You help us become the majority party so that we can create policy positions, pass laws that are going to improve the state in whatever area is of deep concern to you, whether it's education, minimum wage, add the words, you name it. That is a more efficacious use of Democrats' vote rather than surrendering their own power and I would say their own integrity by crossing over. Those are the highlights. Should I repeat them again? I have to tell you that I really adored my mentor in graduate school. He was a famous constitutional law professor, and he told me that after he had just finished his doctorate at Cornell, hired at Yale to teach his first class, the first class didn't go so well. He thought he was fully prepped to teach a good, strong hour. He gave his lecture, 5 minutes had elapsed. So he decided I better repeat it. Did it again, 5 more minutes. That was his first class. Didn't go so well. So I could repeat this and we could take another 20 minutes. Thank you. I hope there's some good questions and some challenging questions because this still is a democracy.
Thank you, Dr. Adler. Questions from the audience?
So this is a question coming from Europe.
Standing?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
A question coming from a European who's very skeptical of the two-party system.
I'm going to walk over here so I can hear because your mask is so effective. Nothing's coming out. Thank you. Veronica, please.
So I was wondering, you were talking about the question of voting as only 2 choices, and there is the independent choice. And I was wondering, what is your position on what is the potential for independence in Idaho? And I'm going to use an example. I was listening to a talk by a senator from Maine, if I'm not mistaken, and he is an independent, and the ability to think critically and not stick to whichever party is saying was very remarkable and seemed to be very effective. So I was just curious what you think in Idaho context. I
appreciate that. That's a great question. I'm fully in favor of the emergence of more candidates for office. I'm sorry, I should repeat that.
Would you repeat that? Because the people.
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the reminder. So this is an excellent question, asking what are the prospects for the emergence of independent candidates or even another party in Idaho and across the nation, what would be the impact on voters' options? Because I was speaking just about the two major parties in the state, Republican and Democratic. So I welcome the emergence of additional, you want me to come back here? Okay. Should I also repeat what I've said as well? Right here. Okay. Thank you. Hello. I welcome the emergence of independent candidates and other parties because they would promote competition of ideas. What we really want in a democracy, of course, is a full-bodied discussion from many different perspectives about the great issues confronting Idaho or America. We always say that the more discussion we have, the better the discussion will become, because the better ideas will rise to the top. That's the theory behind democracy. So the problem would not be too much discussion. We have too little discussion, particularly in a one-party state such as Idaho, where frankly, leaders in the GOP in both the House and the Senate chambers don't have to listen to Democratic members in their chambers, because they outnumber Democrats 4-1, roughly 4-1 in each chamber. So Democrats, I hate to say it, are in many ways irrelevant unless there happens to be an issue in which, and it would be a rare issue, where the Republicans, some member of the GOP needs a Democratic supporter. So I welcome the idea of independent candidates to energize our discussion, particularly so in a one-party state where that party is so dominant that it snuffs out the opportunity for new ideas, new policies, new proposals. And of course, it's difficult for independent parties to emerge in our country, as desirable as it would be. And that's primarily an attribute of the fact that we have an electoral college system to elect the president. All that means is that because voters want their votes to count, they choose one party over the other so that their vote will count for the presidency. And so long as we elect our president by virtue of the electoral college, it's going to make it all the more difficult for independent candidates or parties to emerge. And obviously, when we think about the independent candidates have made a difference in recent presidential elections, often they're denigrated because they have siphoned away votes from the losing candidate for the presidency. And think about Ralph Nader, who was a hero to the cause of consumerism in this country, but won enough votes in the state of Florida, took votes away from Al Gore in the 2000 presidential election that allowed George W. Bush to win that state and thus win the electoral college. That would be different if we move to a direct popular vote, which is my preference, so that the vote of every man and woman in this country would count, that Democratic votes in Idaho would no longer be irrelevant. The Republican votes in California for the presidency would no longer be irrelevant. We would truly move to a more equal playing field. But until we have that kind of a reform, it's going to be increasingly difficult for independent candidates, and even more so for independent parties, to emerge, and thus we deprive ourselves of the opportunity of having multiple perspectives on important issues of our time. Think about this as a microcosm. Bernie Sanders is a Democrat. He's a self-styled socialist, but he stands on the left wing of the Democratic Party. In most cases, he's bringing a very independent view, isn't he? Or an even better example would be Senator Rufus King of Maine, who is in fact a genuine independent, caucuses with the Democrats, but he's an independent voice. What those two can do is to have a big impact on the Democratic Party in Congress, because they can alter where the platform, they can alter the ultimate consensus of the Democrats on an issue. They can push and shove a little bit. And particularly in a United States Senate where The Democrats barely have a majority, and sadly not a working majority these days because of Manchin and Sinema. Those two have an outsized impact on the party, and they are, for all intents and purposes, two independents. So imagine if we replicated that across America and even here in Idaho, where the votes of independents would matter. We can't get to that point. We can't get to that point until the dominant party in this state does not any longer exercise such dominance to the point where it can simply ignore the views of their counterparts in the legislature. So I appreciate that question. It's a very good one, very timely as well. Thank you. Darwin?
If Democrats cross over in the primary and vote for, for a, quote unquote, moderate Republican, it does no damage to their vote in the fall when, so they can cross over and vote for little in the primary and turn around and vote for, the Democratic candidate in the fall. And we know that Republicans are willing to vote for Janice McGeehan as a majority against a very good Democratic candidate.
Right. That's so true. Do I need to repeat it? So the point here made by Darwin is it does not hurt Democrats if they cross over in the primary and then stay true to the Democratic Party in the general election. And the point is made that there are a lot of Republicans who are going to support Janice McGeehan. All true. If you take the long-term interest of the Democratic Party, however, would it not be better for the Democratic governor to have the opportunity, the Democratic candidate for the governorship, to run against, say, Janice McGeehan or Brad Little? Because if Janice McGeehan were elected, then wouldn't voters look with horror at the Republican Party and say, look who you've given us. Look at the positions, the policies, the power held by Janice McGeehan, and look what you've just inflicted on the state. That could, as I suggest, generate momentum to change the party composition in the state. So long as a more moderate candidate like Brad Little wins re-election, but does not, in fact, in his performance as governor, deliver on the issues of great concern to Democrats, whether it's raising the minimum wage, add the words, and greater investment in education, repeal of the sales tax on groceries, whatever the issue is, then his performance is actually negating the interests, the desires, the aspirations of the Democratic Party. So maybe, and this is why I suggested earlier, maybe we need to have an election in which somebody like a Janice McGeehan wins so that Democrats can say, look at what the Republicans have inflicted on this state. And more importantly, Republicans can look inward and ask themselves, why did we want to close primary? And look at our membership and look whom we've chosen. Is this the home? Is this the place we want to call home? Or should we leave the Republican Party, join the Democratic Party, and create a party that's more representative of the interests of Idahoans? That's really the crunch point. That make sense?
The voters in Bonneville County certainly should have known Janice McGeehan in 2018.
Yeah.
But they voted for her in almost exactly the same percentage as they voted for Brad Little. And she was running against a very strong Democratic candidate. So I do really think that Janice McGeehan, A, would lose, and B, 4 years later, do you think she would lose again?
Good question. That's a very good question. Whether if she lost but ran again in 4 years, would she lose again or would she win? If she was elected, right? Exactly. Sorry. Here's the thing. And you've done these statistical reports, so you've been able to compare the performance of Democratic candidates for both governor and lieutenant governor across the years, and you found very little difference. And it seems to not make a difference who the candidate is. It's the party that's going to control. So as you've demonstrated with your statistical studies, whether it's Paulette Jordan or whether it's this candidate or that candidate, the Democratic candidate for governor is going to win 39% or 40 or 41%. It's all the same. So it doesn't matter how good, how strong the Democratic candidate is, because the Republican Party has such a strong presence in the state. So if you're a Democrat, you're asking yourself, how do you change? Because in the view of Democrats, obviously, the Democratic candidates have been far superior to those fielded by the Republican Party, right? Because those Democratic candidates obviously reflect the views of Democrats. And that might be a little arrogant, but that would be the view held by Democrats. So if the Republican fortress is so strong, is it necessarily impregnable, or are there ways to change it? And so the only way to change it is to convince the so-called moderates and independents who fear the election of Janice McGeehan, to convince them they're with the wrong party. If you constantly fear the presence or the increasing strength of the right wing, then you have to ask yourselves as Republicans, how do you weaken that right wing? And the way to do it is to render them powerless by leaving and joining the Democratic Party and reshaping it so it's a party that reflects your views, rather than being frightened day after day after day about what will the right-wing legislators do? What might a right-wing gubernatorial candidate do? And it may be the case, as I suggest, that we would have to face a very difficult, undesirable outcome for people to wake up and see what in fact has occurred is a result of the Republicans' decision to close their primary and in fact to support and to fail to stand up to the Republican far right. That's really what is required if the Democrats are ever to become a strong party, because Democrats do believe they field very strong candidates. They have yet to win over statewide voters. So in addition to that, Democratic candidates have to have good messaging and remind Idaho voters that life could be much better. You could have a fair tax system, a better educational system, wouldn't have to have a sales tax on groceries, could have a minimum wage that's higher, could have protections for all Idahoans in the civil rights statute. So.
And Dr. Adler, can ask you to move a little bit further this way for our home audience.
Right here.
Great, that's
And,
great.
and should I repeat everything I said again?
I think we got it.
We got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I want to remind everyone that this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. And the audio will be provided by our media partner, Boise State Public Radio. I'd like to take a question from our folks at home. There are two questions here that piggyback upon one another.
Great.
You cited the Otter primary election, but what about the Little Labrador primary?
Good. That's a very excellent question. So the Otter primary is very clear. I think with respect to the Little primary, I'm trying to remember the margin of votes by which Brad Little defeated Raul Labrador. I don't recall offhand, but I do not think that the number of people crossing over made a difference in that victory for Brad Little. And so Democrats not only some 1,300 or 1,000 Democrats, however many crossed over, actually voted for a candidate whose views probably do not square with the views of those voters. But again, they helped to, if Brad Little is perceived as a more moderate candidate who is perceived as the better governor for the future of the Republican Party, then Democrats have just helped to strengthen the Republican Party and lengthen the term of dominance, as opposed to, let us say, the election of Raul Labrador, whose positions on many issues would have been anathema to Democrats and would have been better for the Democratic Party fortunes going forward, because again, the state could have seen this is the candidate that the Republicans have given us. These are the positions, these are the policy positions the viewpoints of this candidate. Is this really going to be the home for Republican voters? So once more, it's the whole question of what does it take to convince members of the Republican Party that in fact they are responsible for the election of their candidates. And so there's that element of accountability, Republicans to Republicans, just as there's the element of accountability of those in government to people in Idaho.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that question, Dr. Adler, is it your understanding that this has been an organized effort on behalf of the Republicans making the ask to the Democrats, or is this Democrats initiating this request?
Yeah, I like that question. I think it's some of both. Oh, sure. As this appeal to Democratic voters to cross over, is it a function of an organized statewide effort by the Republicans, or is it more an organized effort by Democrats, or is it a more casual kind of anecdotal plea? I think it's some of both. I've heard from friends across the state who have asked me to try to do what I can to persuade Democrats to in fact cross over. And there have been some Republicans of note, people, men and women whom I respect, admire, who have also written op-eds in various newspapers in the state, who have urged Democrats really to cross over and vote for the most moderate candidate they can. And that's an exercise in cutting your losses, I think. So I think it's some of both. There are well-known Republicans who are entering this plea with Democratic voters, some Democrats who are pushing it. And then there are those who are simply committed to the cause of trying to support more moderate representatives, which we might all like, but I think it's something of a ruse, because once more, to maintain the idea that there are moderate Republicans in the legislature as opposed to the far right-wing members requires a demonstration of a different voting record, requires a demonstration that those so-called moderates are willing to stand up to the far right-wingers, denounce them when they're punishing Boise State, for example, or they are unwilling to add the words, or they're unwilling to repeal the sales tax on groceries, or whatever else might be described as a moderate position. And of course, there's a game that can be played, of course, by anybody who wants to adopt the so-called middle position between two opponents, because on the surface, it looks as though the person in the middle is more reasonable, more open-minded. But that's simply an empty claim in many cases. Thank you.
Another question from the audience?
Please.
Is there any possibility that the legislature could pass something which would require someone who crosses over to stay in that party for 6 months or more? I've heard rumors.
A good question. Is there anything to the argument that the legislature could pass a law to say if somebody crosses over that they have to stay with that party for a certain duration of time, at least through the next election? Yes, certainly can pass a law. Once you've passed a law to say you've voted with the Republicans in a primary, then you cannot vote as a Democrat in the election. Yeah, you have essentially exercised your free speech rights to that effect, to make that choice. Pardon me? How would anyone know is the question? Well, because when you register, whenever you register, right now you can register on voting day, but as you know, we've got a bill in the works to push that day back so that you have to register. You have to affiliate with the party on the last day that somebody has to file for office. So you would know through the registration. How they voted? No. So no, good question. Would I know how they voted? You would not. You would just have to say that, I see your question. If you affiliated, that's right. Well, that's the same thing as saying now if you cross over to vote, although it's a good point, because if you cross over to vote, Well, you only get that ballot. That's the answer. You only get that ballot with Republicans as opposed to a Democratic candidate. That's what the law, that's what a law.
But in the final election, the general election,
Mhm.
no one knows how you voted.
Right. So good question. I think the answer would be that this law, a rumored law, a hypothetical law, who knows, would have to say that once you've affiliated, this is the ballot you get in the general election. The ballots would be redrawn. In other words, this is a ballot with Republican, like here's your straight ticket, as opposed to being able to vote on both sides. That would probably be what that law would have to do. I don't know if there's any momentum, any significance to this rumor. Obviously, my own preference is that there would be open primaries. In an open primary, people could choose to move one party or the other. Although I would say if you're a partisan of one party or the other, you want your members to vote for your candidates to strengthen your own party.
Thank you. We have a question over here in the corner.
Please.
So you're talking about how if the Republicans saw that McGeechan was horrible and why did we do that to ourselves? But if you look at the demographics of who's moving into this valley, into Meridian and Eagle, Caldwell, it's all right wingers from other states. There's more of them now than there used to be.
Yes.
So would we even get to that point where they thought that she was a nutcase?
I like that question. So we talk about people moving into this valley and they're all right wingers. What's the impact of that on these kinds of questions? So what I would say, I would have paraphrased your question to say, a lot of people were hopeful that people moving from California would have a different political persuasion. So what you say is the wrong Californians are moving to the valley. That's right. The wrong Californians are moving to the valley. So here there are two concerns. One, given the fact, if it is a fact, that more conservatives, right-wingers are moving into Idaho from California and elsewhere, that simply serves to strengthen the GOP, doesn't it? Strengthens the Republican Party. So if Democrats cross over and help support the Republican primary candidates, whichever one they vote for, then in fact, they are participating in the continued growth. What you want to see if you're a Democrat is a diminution of the vote in the Republican Party. You want to see the numbers cratering. You want to see people saying to themselves, this Republican Party is not my Republican Party. It's not the party I've known for my whole life when I registered when I was 19 and am proud to cast a ballot for a conservative candidate, which of course is occurring right now, as you know, on the national scene, because a number of notable syndicated political columnists for a long time, for much of their lives, were diehard conservative Republicans. They've left the party because they don't recognize the party. That would include George Will, for example. It would include David Brooks of the New York Times and Rubin of the Washington Post, all Republicans who now identify with the Democrats. In a way, they call themselves Scoop Jackson Democrats, after the former senator from the state of Washington, conservative Democrats. And that's what I have in mind when I say that Democrats in this state could appeal to so-called moderates here, moderate Republicans, and say, this party no longer represents your interests. It was one thing when Dwight Eisenhower was your candidate, or even when Ronald Reagan was your candidate, or one of the George Bushes was your candidate. This party is unrecognizable, which has led to the retreat of George Will and Buckley and Rubin, Brooks and others. But probably it'd be fair to say William F. Buckley would not recognize this Republican Party. It would not recognize, Lincoln would not recognize this. So that's the appeal, you see. If those hardcore Republican conservative writers of note for 40 or 50 years can say, I've had it, I leave the party, there has to be the opportunity for Democrats to appeal to Republicans to do something similar. And it cannot help the Democratic cause, I say, if Democrats cross over and help to renew the numbers, the strength, the vitality of the party in a primary election. In other words, Democrats should say, the party's off limits. The Republican Party's off limits because we want to grow the Democratic Party. We don't want to aid and abet the effort of the dominant party to further cement its position as a one-party state, as it's been for 60-odd years. Thank you.
We have a question from our listeners at home. In your opinion, what would the functional difference be between the leadership of Little administration versus McKeon in today's climate?
Oh, I like that question. In my view, what would be the functional difference between a Brad Little and a Janice McGeehan administration? That's a really good question. And of course, we would not know until one or the other is elected. And we couldn't really contrast them, of course, unless we had a Janice McGeehan term to compare to the Little administration. Here's what I would say. On some issues of great importance to Democrats, would there be a functional difference between the two when it comes to add the words? No. Would there be a functional difference between the two if the Democratic issue of repealing the sales tax on groceries became a matter before the administration? The answer would be no. Neither one has supported it. Would there be a functional difference on any number of issues? So that's why it would be hard to know, but I don't think there would be many differences because Governor Little has moved to the right, as many would say, signing very restrictive abortion law bills into law, by the way. And it may have been to protect his flank, his right flank, as they say, or it might be that these are really his views. He did, after all, sign into law the bill that prohibits the teaching of critical race theory, which again, doesn't matter because no Idaho teacher teaches it. Probably very few understand it, including Republicans who supported the bill, I dare say. And the reality is that if he signs these bills into law, then where is the functional difference between a Little administration and a McGeehan administration? Now, if a McGeehan administration I have to watch this, supported right-wing militia groups in Idaho, that might be a functional difference, but I don't know. There may not be a difference. It's hard to know. So that's a really excellent question. But on issues of great importance to Democrats, I would say there might not be a functional difference.
Other questions from the audience?
As near as I can tell, the Idaho Republican Party is right where they want to be. They have been moving this direction for at least a couple decades. And these moderates who want to change it, they got run out of the party decades ago. So this notion of trying to put in a fix every 4 years by crossing over is kind of what I see as your point. So how can we get energy for disaffected Republicans and Democrats and independents to like somehow be a strong voting bloc? Because it seems like nobody cares about those votes.
Excellent. Good points. Excellent question. Thank you. So if we are at the point where the GOP is where it wants to be, and the moderates support, the so-called moderates of the Republican Party are supporting this, then there is no benefit for Democrats to cross over because there won't be any difference, no functional difference between the so-called moderates and the so-called right-wingers in the legislature. And so the other part of your question is, if so-called moderate Republicans said, we really don't like where we are, that in fact, publicly, they posture to support the right wing because they don't want to incur the wrath of certain organizations, and they have to go along to get along, but privately they complain, as some have to me over the years. The reality is, in office, in public office, what you do in public matters. What you do when it comes to voting on bills and policies is what counts. So Democrats, you ask, how can momentum, how can energy be gained to make a difference? It has to begin with Democrats, I think, reminding Republicans that if there is any law, any policy, any program in this state that you don't like, understand that's the handiwork of the Republican Party, because the Republicans have governed this state almost without exception for 60 odd years. That's what Democratic candidates need to be saying. And they could back it up by saying to voters, are you concerned about the future of your children? Do you want a better investment in education than for Idaho to be last in the nation? Are you concerned about your future or the future of your children when minimum wage is $7.25 and something like 35% of the jobs in this state are low-wage jobs? Are you concerned about the future of your children being able to have a better life, to buy homes, to enjoy the fruits of better legislation and programs and policies? Then it will not be to continue what has occurred for the past 60 years. That's the kind of burden or opportunity, if you will, that Democratic candidates will carry if they hope to make a difference. And if you ask these questions that I just posed of any member of the GOP, any GOP voter, that simple question: is there a single law, a single policy, a single program that makes you unhappy? And that is the handiwork of the GOP. And the answer is no. There is not a single law, single policy, single program, single regulation in this station that makes me happy. Then you could say to those people in this wonderland, this fantasy land, well, you're very lucky because you are living where you want to be. And you would be happy then with a state that is last in the nation when it comes to education, has a regressive income tax, has a minimum wage that is not a livable wage, and so forth. But I bet you that if Democratic candidates ask that of Republicans, they're going to say, sure, I don't like A, B, and C. And then the Democratic candidate can say, well, here's your chance. Because the party that has produced A, B, and C that makes you unhappy is the party that's ruled for 60 years.
As a follow-up to that question from the home audience, is this a message that would appeal to the younger generations, like the millennials? What is the sleeping giant? How do we engage that the younger demographic?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. If this is the message, is this a message that would appeal to the sleeping giant, the millennial generation, the great number of potential voters who can make a difference? I say it is. And so you ask yourself, what are the issues, or what are some of the issues of concern to the millennials? Everything I read suggests they don't like bigotry. They don't like discrimination. And that means they would be in favor of, add the words, which would mean equal protection of the law for all Idahoans. All Idahoans, not protection for some Idahoans, but not protection of rights for other Idahoans. That's one issue. Another would be, as the millennials look toward their own future, their ability to earn a good wage, their ability to buy a house, then they're going to ask themselves, what are the conditions that prevail in the state that affect my own immediate future? On the old theme by Tip O'Neill that all politics is local. I want to know what's going to affect my interest. Here you go. I want to know, will salaries, will wages in this state grow appreciably so I can buy a home? That is affected by the willingness of businesses and corporations to move into Idaho to create better jobs because they see the Idaho workforce has the skills and the talents that they need to hire in their companies. But when they look around and they see that the go-on rate for high school students is still low, when they see that the state is not investing in education and last in the country, means that those companies and businesses can't say to their shareholders, can't say to their prospective employees, we're going to move to beautiful Idaho. You're going to love the beauty. You're not going to make any money, but you're going to love the beauty. So soak up the psychic benefits. Then in effect, the inability to attract those companies and the jobs that pay very well will become very, very difficult for millennials to accept. And maybe they all also don't believe that there should be a regressive income tax. Maybe they do believe that the wealthiest should pay their share, that taxes on corporations should not be cut, that in fact, money should be invested in the future of Idaho, including the repeal of the sales tax on groceries. Those issues, I think, are of great interest to millennials. And so that really is an excellent question. Thank you.
We're at the end of our time here this evening. Want to remind everyone that this was recorded this evening and will be posted on the City Club YouTube channel, and the audio will be provided to our media partner, Boise State Public Radio. We want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Adler, for your
My
time.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to our sponsors who make this possible. Thank you to our members. With your support, we bring people together to explore community issues and hear diverse viewpoints by creating spaces where conversations happen. For more information on how you can support City Club, please visit our website at cityclubboise.org. And if you have any further questions here in the audience, I'm sure Dr. Adler will take a few more minutes to stand by.
Sure.
Thank you again so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me. Thank you for your great questions. I enjoyed them. Thank you again.